My name is W.H. Taylor. Actually, my name is Warner Homer Taylor, and when you get named Warner Homer, you go by W.H. I was born in April of 1953 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas at the Davis Hospital. Well, I initially lived in Star City until I was about 5 years old. My mother and dad lived there. They split up whenever I was about 5, and my mother and the rest of us kids, I had 4 siblings at that point. We moved to Fordyce and grew up there, kind of a hard scrabble life. I sort of quickly became a reader, which probably was the big change or the biggest part of my life whenever I was a little kid is learning to read and escaping into books and that sort of thing.
Tell me about where you went to school and what it was like there.
I went to school initially in Fordyce. Actually, I started first grade in Thornton, and then I moved to Fordyce. Thornton's about 4 miles south of Fordyce, Arkansas. The Fordyce school system was extraordinary. By way of example, in my 6th grade class at Fordyce, there's a Supreme Court justice that I was in school with. There's a doctor. There's a West Point graduate. There's about 10 people with master's degrees. There's 6 pharmacists, I think, and several teachers. And that's out of a class of about 65 or 70 people. So we had a really remarkable school system in Fordyce. Unfortunately, I don't think it's that good anymore.
Tell me about how you ended up coming to Washington County.
Well, that's sort of a long story. When I got out of high school, I worked at the service station where I'd worked in high school until September of 1971. At that point, I went and joined the Army. Got shipped to Fort Lewis, Washington for basic training, went to Fort Ord for AIT, and by February of 1972, I was in Ansbach, Germany. And I lived there for 2.5 years as a GI, came back, wandered my happy ass up to UCA to go to school. And I had graduated high school with like a D- average, but they let me start to college, even though I'd never taken ACT, never taken SAT. Started to college, did pretty well, went there for 18 months, and on January the 1st of 1977, I moved to Fayetteville in a Volkswagen Rabbit, and all my clothes. And a few days later, my now ex-wife, she moved up here and we started to college, and both of us ended up graduating with bachelor's degrees. And then I got into law school, and a couple years after that, she got into law school. And she is now retired and lives in Florida, and she's had a real good career. But when I first got to Fayetteville, I rented a place from Coach. I don't know if you know who Coach is, but that was Mr. Pierce. And Mr. Pierce's family, he owned quite a bit of property down on Dixon Street. And I lived back in behind the old U-Ark Bowl. And I lived in an apartment that cost $90 a month, furnished. And a guy that you probably know named Steve Wright, who was an outdoor editor for the Democrat Gazette for a while, lived across the hallway from me. And it was a whole different world in Fayetteville back then. It was pretty much nothing but hippies down on Dixon Street. And Steve and I fit right in. So, and I ended up getting a degree in history and then went on to law school in the fall of 1978. law school was entirely different than going to undergraduate school, but I sort of enjoyed it, and I made a lot of wonderful friends in law school.
Talk about when you first started practicing law, what you did and where you were.
In March of 1980, I got a job as a law clerk with Charlie Davis. I had sent out some resumes, and Charlie was a very colorful lawyer who, in Springdale, I didn't know that at that point, but I subsequently found out he was very colorful. But I came in and my ex-wife said, hey, some crazy guy called and said he'd like to interview you in the morning at 6 o'clock. So I called up this crazy guy who was Mr. Davis, and he said, yeah, I'll be out here at 6 o'clock. I said, buddy, I don't go anywhere at 6 o'clock. He said, well, have your ass out here at 7:30. I said, well, okay. So I go out there, and he said, well, there's 2 questions I have to ask you to see if you can have a job here. And he said, the first one is, are you a foot washing Baptist? And I said, no. And he said, the second is, will you take a drink? And I said, yes. And he said, you got a job. That was my interview for starting in the law business. I worked there until I graduated in September, or got licensed in September of 1981. And Charlie Davis let me basically do anything I wanted to. He had all kinds of business. We had everything from murders to probate files to workers' comp files, Social Security files, anything you could think of, and he would just let me go do it. He didn't care. I didn't have any restrictions, and it was a wonderful training ground. And probably I did some things I shouldn't have been doing, but thank God it all turned out okay. Because I tried a murder case within a year of graduating law school, which I really wouldn't recommend to a young lawyer. But I stayed there with Charlie until 1984, November of '84, I think. And I went into practice for a short period of time with Jeff Watson in Springdale, who's a local lawyer out in Springdale still. But in early 1986, Mike Mashburn and I opened a practice in Fayetteville up on the square, and we were partners for 16 years until he took the bench, and by then there had been lots of other lawyers added, including Tim Brooks, who's now the United States District Court judge, Scott Smith, who is one of the best lawyers in the state, and Terry Harper, who grew up here in Fayetteville, and several other people have been added through the years, and now the law firm consists of 12 lawyers and Judge Gibson, who's off counsel.
Who were some of the judges that you remember and prosecutors back in the day when you first started? The
judges and the prosecutors I distinctly remember. I'll start with the judges. Judge Tom Butt was the chancellor at that point. And at that point in time, Arkansas had a different system in most of the other states in that we had circuit courts and chancery courts. But Judge Butt was a legend in Arkansas. He ended up being the longest serving chancellor, I believe, ever in the state. And Judge Butt was a very thoughtful, precise man who made you do it the right way. Then Judge Lineberger was the other chancellor. He was a younger guy, very smart, very well versed in the law, maybe not as patient as Judge Butt, but they complemented each other. And when I started, the 2 circuit judges were Paul Jameson, who did all the civil work, by way of example, like contracts or car wrecks, that sort of thing, and Judge Malin Gibson, who handled all the criminal docket. Judge Jameson had been a bank lawyer. He was a cantankerous fella who was difficult to practice in front of, but you learn to do that. Judge Gibson was a dream to practice in front of, an easy man to get along with, and very well versed in the law. I distinctly remember one time I practiced law probably for a year and a half, and I walk up in front of Judge Gibson and I say, "You know, Judge, I'm going to have to plead my first person guilty." And his response was, "You're overdue." But he and I have remained friends since 1981, and he's off counsel here, and we're close friends. The prosecutor at that point in time was Kim Smith, and he had only recently been elected. Kim was probably maybe 32, 33 years old. One of his deputies was a guy by the name of, or one of his deputies shortly before I was licensed to practice was a guy named Sam Hewer, who I later practiced law with for a while at Charlie's office. Chester Bogus was a deputy prosecutor. Chester's well known among the older folks of this community. And Kim turned out to be a wonderful prosecutor, did the people a good job, and subsequently, whenever Judge Jameson quit, he ran for office, and as you probably know, won with about 75% of the vote, and I don't think he ever got less than 70% of the vote. The rest of the time he was in office, and spent many years on the bench, and retired probably 10 years ago, 8 or 10 years ago. The city prosecutor back then, if I'm remembering right, was Terry Jones, and I believe that Charlie Williams was the district, what we call the municipal judge back then, and he was, they were both nice people and easy to practice law in front of and with. Over in Madison County, there was a colorful fellow by the name of W.Q. Hall, and W.Q. liked to hold court in his overalls. And he liked to wear a black derby whenever he was sitting on the bench, and he would be damn hard to get along with sometime, but he was a most interesting guy.
Tell about some of the prosecutors over the years. You had Zeiser, and then, you know.
We had Andrew Zeiser, who spent a short period in office. He and I recollect trying one murder case against him, where I represented a lady who had allegedly killed a guy with a butcher knife, and my defense was accidental self-defense. What had happened was she was cutting up a pork chop for her little son, and they had been into it, shall we say, and she saw this fellow running toward her to hit her, or she thought he was going to hit her, and she instinctively stuck her hands up, and he ran into the butcher knife. The jury acquitted her in about 40 minutes, probably because they thought maybe he deserved killing more than the accidental self-defense. But I tried that against Andrew. Andrew, I don't know if you remember him well, but he was one of the nicest people you'll ever meet in your life. After that, of course, Terry Jones became the prosecutor. Terry was an unusual prosecutor in that Terry really did not like authority, and he didn't like police very much. He sort of took the view that, hey, The police's job is to catch these people. It's my job to decide how they're prosecuted and who gets prosecuted. He didn't put up with interference from law enforcement in his office. And I think we've been very fortunate in Washington County for that sort of tradition to continue, because you have this check system of where the police are not in lockstep with the prosecutors in this county. Terry was a good guy, a fair guy, and he liked to do what he called unofficial probation. Unofficial probation was whenever a young kid got in trouble and you could call Terry and say, hey, if you won't file charges on him, I'll sort of watch over him. I'll send him to a counselor, or I'll send him to a mental health professional, and I'll send reports into your office, and if you'll just hold his file in your desk drawer, we'll take care of it just between us. Really, it was a diversion program. And Terry and I did a lot of those cases. Some of those people we diverted are now lawyers here in Benton and Washington County. He had a very good career. We tried several cases against each other, we tried the Koger murder case. You may remember that. That's where the pharmacist was accused of killing his lover and then loaded her up and took her to Madison County and burnt the body. And as he was leaving town, he called me and said he had a little problem that he wanted me to work on. Subsequently, I negotiated his surrender. We tried his case. He was convicted, but only given 10 years on a first-degree murder charge, and ended up doing 2.5 years. And I really don't know whatever happened to Mr. Koger after that. His name was Larry Koger. After that, John Threep became the prosecutor, and he is now the circuit judge. But during most of my career, or early career, I did a lot of practice in Benton County, Arkansas, where there was a circuit judge by the name of Bill Enfield. And Judge Enfield was this wonderfully smart, demanding person who all the lawyers would tell you that if you could try a case in Judge Enfield's court, you can try a case in anybody's court. And the prosecutor in Benton County at that point was a man by the name of David Klinger, who I consider to this day the best prosecutor that I ever tried a case against. And he was in office for over 20 years. At one time, he was known as just a force of nature up there in Benton County of locking people up because he had so much horsepower. And I formed up a close friendship in those early years with a guy named Jeff Duty. Jeff Duty, at the time I met him, was 70. He was 76. I think he was 76. No, he's about 81. He's about 81 when I met him. He had practiced law since 1930 at that point, which would have been in the early 80s that I met him. And I formed up a friendship with him, and we tried cases together for like 10, 12 years till he passed away when he was 92 years old. He practiced law for 68 years. And Jeff had been the prosecutor in Washington County, Madison County. He had been the assistant attorney general before coming back to Fayetteville in the early 50s and practicing law. So those are some of the people that sort of were my mentors whenever I first started. And I couldn't say that any of those people were, quote, the only mentors. I was lucky enough to that a lot of people helped me early on. I mean, there were some really, really good lawyers in the bar at that point. People like Sid Davis, who had a long career here, Bill Bassett, Bill Putman, Walter Cox. All of those people were very instrumental in helping me and teaching me how to practice law.
If you had to say who some of the top lawyers are now, I mean, your name often comes up, but who would you say are the top lawyers practicing in Washington County now?
Well, it's different than it used to be. It's very different than it used to be, because you can't really sort of segment people as the best lawyer anymore, because now people are much more specialized. You know, in the old days, whenever I started, people could try almost anything. They could close a road on people. They could try a murder trial, or try a divorce case, or try a products case, or try a car wreck. That's not done anymore. There's only probably 2 or 3 of us left. John Everett can do that still. His son-in-law, Jason Wales, can do that still. But now people are very specialized. And when you start thinking about specialization, one of the best divorce lawyers in the state is a guy named Greg Clerk, who's in Bentonville. My law partner, Scott Smith, is recognized as one of the best divorce lawyers in the state. If you're talking about medical malpractice, car wrecks, that sort of thing, obviously Don Elliott comes to mind, who's here in Fayetteville. My law partner, Tim Myers, comes to mind. Tim Smith, who is Elliott's law partner, is a very good lawyer. If you're talking about estate planning, Joe Reese, or Jack Butt. If you want a brief rote, you get Connie Clark to do it. And it depends on what area of the law that you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a banking issue, it just depends on what area of the law is called into play. What's fundamentally changed the law business, and the reason one of the big changes in the law business is mediation. You don't have many trials anymore. You have lots of people doing alternative dispute resolution in divorce cases, civil cases, that sort of thing. And the other thing that's really changed the law business is the number of women that have entered into the profession since I started. When I first started, there were very few women that actually practiced law. Now, probably half the bar is women, and half the judges are women now, and they bring a little different perspective to the law business, I think, than just white men brought, old white men, whenever I started into law practice.
Speaking of women judges, drug court has been a big change over the years and kind of a way to keep people out of prison. Talk about how you think that program has impacted that.
Well, you got to drop back and you got to think about what's happened in this country. And in 1980, there was 400,000 people in prison in this country. Now there's 2.3 million. Most of those people who are in jail are in there as a result of drugs and alcohol. We fought the war on drugs for 40 years, 50 years. And we have failed miserably in that fight, because all we did is lock people up and tear families apart instead of trying to solve the problem. And we have finally, I think, got on the right path of trying to rehabilitate people instead of punish people. It's hard to believe sometimes, but we literally, when I started practicing law, we used to lock people up. I didn't lock anybody up, but I mean, I had to defend people who would get caught with maybe 2 or 3 bags of marijuana, and they were faced with going to prison. Or maybe a guy had 5 hits of LSD. He was faced with getting an offer generally of 15 years, and he would have to do 1/6 of that before he'd get out. And of course, all that's changed now, thank God. Very seldom do you see people go to prison unless they are dealing large amounts of opioids or methamphetamine. And most of those cases where they get a lot of time is over in the federal system, where there's these big conspiracies and there's a lot of people involved in the distribution of drugs. But we need federal money. We need a federal program to pour a lot of money into rehabilitation of people, especially with the opioid problem we have in this country now. It's I don't think people realize what a tremendous problem that is out here in society. And heroin is going to be in northwest Arkansas and in all through Arkansas quite heavily over the next 3 to 5 years, because that's what happened in Ohio, and that's what happened in Appalachia area and all of that. And we just have to expect that to happen, and we need to have programs set up to try to catch those people. The judge who runs our program now in Washington County is a lady by the name of Christy Beaumont, who does a wonderful job, is very patient with people, has her one rule is, and I think this is her only rule, which is, you tell me the truth. And as long as people tell her the truth, she will work with them till the end of the day to try to graduate them from drug court. And she does a really good job. The drug court judge up in Benton County is a fellow by the name of Tom Smith. And Tom does a very good job of trying to rehabilitate people, trying to get them back into mainstream of society. And really what you're trying to do is, build up their self-esteem, get them back on track, get them a job, restart their life. And it works, but it's difficult.
Recently, I visited with Denny Highslip, and he was talking about the huge number of cases that the public defenders get. I mean, what kind of a job is that as a public defender, and how important is it? Well,
I was one of the initial people appointed to the Public Defenders Commission in 1992, by Governor Tucker, and I served on that for many years, and then when the Republicans came into office, I seemed to have lost my position for a while. But then when the Democrats came back in with Mike Beebe, I was reappointed to the Public Defenders Commission, and my tenure on that is going to end in just a few days. So I've sort of watched the whole process take place. In the old days, before the Public Defenders Commission was established, local lawyers were appointed by judges. And it was a system that had lots of problems with it. The main problem was there wasn't any money in the system for experts. There wasn't any money to pay lawyers. Jim Lingle and I, who's a lawyer in Rogers, we tried a 12-day jury trial in Benton County, Arkansas in a capital murder case and got paid each the sum of $1,200 in 1985. We were given the princely sum of $500 to retain an expert for our client whose defense was mental disease or defect. So the system didn't work very well. The only thing that was good about the system is it was a great training ground for lawyers. Young lawyers got appointed to cases that were serious cases, and they had to learn how to practice law. The system now that exists is overburdened. There's not enough money. People don't like to pay money to defend people in criminal trouble. The public defenders in Washington County do an extraordinarily good job in working with the prosecution and working with the courts to handle these cases. And there's some really good lawyers in the public defender system, especially in Washington County. But they have too many cases. And one of these days, some enterprising young lawyer is going to sue the state of Arkansas because the Public Defenders Commission has too many cases, and people do not get the same quality of legal representation that they would get if they had the money to retain a lawyer. But that goes back to society in general, and especially the criminal justice system. Rich people, upper middle class people, even middle class people have a much better chance of getting a fair shake in the criminal judicial system than if you're a poor person. And that, unfortunately, is the way it's been in this country probably for 200 years. And we need to change that.
Over the years, you've dealt with a lot of people in the circuit clerk's office, and it used to be obviously more manual than it is now, where it's become more automated. But talk about the different clerks and the systems you worked with there.
Well, when I started, of course, there was the circuit clerk of Washington County was Alma Kohlmeyer, and Alma had a bunch of people working for her, and they all sat in this one big room, and there was Betty Stamps, there was a lady named BJ, several different people, and it was all just a manual process. We would go to the clerk's office, and if you wanted to look in a file, you would go back into a back room and you'd pull out a file drawer and you'd take the file out and you'd look through it. If you wanted to walk out of the courthouse with the file, well, that was okay. You'd walk across the street, maybe over to the other courthouse, and that was right across the street on Center Street. We had a courthouse annex over there. Or if you need to look at some land records, you'd just go back there in the back and look, and people would help you, but it was a very loose, trusting system. And that has, by and large, continued, but now Betty Stamps went on to become the circuit clerk and served a long time. Kathleen Harness served prior to Betty serving. And all of those women done a wonderful job. But the system is entirely different now. Now we do what's called e-file. And so if I want to file an order, that's done electronically over the internet, and it will pop up, as we say, in about an hour or so after you file it. And there's a system called Court Connect that you can get on, and once you're logged in, you can look at different cases all over the state. And it's got some problems, but it's the wave of the future, and everything considered, it's probably superior to what we used to have. But the clerk's office was the great gathering place too. Lawyers got to see each other. Lawyers got to negotiate cases out in the big hallway there at the old courthouse at the head of Center Street. So some of that's been removed out of the law business because of this computer error, and we just don't interact like we used to. And it doesn't quite have the warmth to it that it did when I started practicing law.
What are some other stories that stand out over the years that you remember? Or maybe some people that we haven't talked about?
Well, there's many stories, and things that you kind of look back on and you wonder, how in the hell did I survive all of that? To go back to Charlie Davis, the very first criminal trial I ever tried was with Charlie. I represented a woman. Her and her two sons had got into it with a deputy, and they had beat him terribly, and this was over in Marion County. And Charlie actually, I represented the mother, and Charlie represented one of the boys, and a public defender represented the other boy. So we go over there and we try the case the first day, and on our way back from Marion County back to Springdale, Charlie Davis turns to me and he said, "Taylor, you'll have to go it alone tomorrow. I got a divorce I got to do in Eureka Springs." So I had to go back over to Marion County and represent his client and my client. But it all turned out okay. But that was Charlie. You never knew what was sort of going to happen next with him. I distinctly remember whenever I was a real young lawyer, the fellow I mentioned before, Jeff Duty, called me, and his exact words were, "I've got a case I want to put you on." And so he did, and this lady's name was Angie Dennison. And Angie was a young girl who allegedly had lured a guy into a bedroom, and the co-defendant had taken a half-gallon of whiskey and hit this old boy upside the head and nearly cut his neck off. I mean, it was a bad deal. And she was charged with aggravated robbery. And my friend David Klinger, who was the prosecutor in Benton County, had sent law enforcement to Alaska to get her because she ran off to Alaska after this happened. They bring her back. By the time we go to trial, she's about 6 months pregnant. And so we start trying this case right before Christmas, and I get her dressed up in a little maternity dress and little flat shoes, and she has little blue bows in her hair. And we tried that case for 4 days with really no defense to it other than the fact that she was just a kid. And the jury came back and acquitted her, much to David Klinger's chagrin. And to this day, 35 years later, if you mention her name, he becomes immediately angry. But that's the kind of case, of course, you remember. The case I told you we tried for 12 days, Jim Lingle and I, involved a man by the name of William Frankie Parker. Frankie had went over to his mother-in-law and daddy-in-law's house, shot at his sister-in-law, missed her, went in and killed his father-in-law, killed his mother-in-law, drove across town, took his ex-wife hostage, went to the Rogers Police Department, went in and shot a man 3 times, a policeman. And there was a 7-hour standoff at the Rogers Police Department until Mr. Parker was shot in the neck, and he turned around and shot his ex-wife in the chest. And so I'm the young lawyer in one of the young lawyers in Benton County at that point, and Judge Enfield appointed me to represent Mr. Parker. And so when I go in to see Mr. Parker, his words were, "Pretty tough case, huh?" He had a sense of humor, kind of black sense of humor. But we tried that case, like I say, for 12 days, and he was convicted, given the death penalty. We appealed at Supreme Court. It was reversed on several grounds. And at that point, Judge Enfield had had enough of Jim Lingle, and he'd had enough of me, that he let us out of the case and appointed Mr. Parker 2 other lawyers who went, and the case was tried again. He was given the death penalty, and he was executed in 1996. So that was a one to remember. And there's been a lot of stories like that. What happened to me, though, is after I went into practice with Mike Mashburn in 1986, what I thought I wanted to do was to become a products lawyer and in effect, a car wreck lawyer, because there was a lot of money to be made in doing that, and I thought I enjoyed that work, and I did enjoy it for a few years, but I got to the point of where I didn't enjoy it anymore, because people become quite desperate whenever they're injured and their case is proceeding slowly and the system is slow. And I sort of just got really wore out on dealing with people day in and day out in that arena. And I was lucky enough one day for the phone to ring, and a guy named Jim Blair said, "Can you go to Memphis with me?" And Blair, of course, was general counsel for Tyson Foods, and I had known Mr. Blair, but not well. Well, we got on the Tyson jet, flew to Memphis, and over the next 5 or 6 years, my practice transitioned from being sort of a cornbread, local, small town practice to being in Washington most of the time, involved in all these independent counsel investigations that occurred, primarily representing Tyson Foods and different people in this area who were involved in that and in the campaign finance, independent counsel, the Whitewater matter, and as a result of that, I got to know lots of people in D.C., lots of lawyers, and learned a lot about the white-collar practice law and about federal criminal practice, which I've continued through the years. When I came home, and that's the way I look at it, when I came home in about 98, 99, I was actually spending probably more time in Washington than I was here. I just never went back to doing the products or the car wrecks or any of those things. I ended up drifting off into handling serious criminal cases, especially federal criminal cases, and really becoming more of a counselor than sometimes being a trial lawyer. I mean, I handle lots of things that people never know about, which is hopefully the way it should be. But I did become involved in, like I say, the federal criminal practice, and that is entirely different than a state court practice. There's different rules that apply. There's what's known as the sentencing guidelines, which is entirely different than anything in the state system. I ended up, probably the most high-profile case I ever had in federal court was that I ended up representing Tom Conklin, who was the number 2 guy in Walmart, who was accused of stealing from the company. He was indicted. I handled that case with a very good group of lawyers out of D.C. The lead lawyer was a guy named William Taylor. And the other lawyer was Blair Brown. But we handled that case, a very difficult case, and we were fortunate enough the judge gave Mr. Conklin 27 months of home detention. And we used to refer, the biggest problem that Tom had after that was that his ankle monitor didn't work in the deep end of his swimming pool when he was on detention for 27 months. The government was not happy. So the government appealed that case to the 8th Circuit. The 8th Circuit reversed Judge Dawson. Bob Dawson was the judge in that case. The 8th Circuit reversed Judge Dawson and said, in effect, he'd been too lenient on Mr. Conklin and that the Bureau of Prisons could take care of him. He had a heart condition. Well, Judge Dawson, being Judge Dawson, he resentenced Mr. Conklin to 27 months home detention, gave him 1,500 hours of public service, and told him, you can do your public service anytime you want to, Mr. Conklin, including going to the restaurants in the morning and having coffee with your friends to get all this good works arranged. So in effect, he allowed Mr. Conklin to be off of home detention, and that was the end of the case. And Tom and I, by the time it was over, became very close friends, and he has now passed away, but he was really a fine person. That was the highest profile case I have had in federal court. John Everett and I tried a case in the early 90s in federal court that I remember very well. It involved, I represented a lawyer, and it was alleged that this lawyer had arranged for all the surveyors in Northwest Arkansas to violate what's known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act says that people cannot gather together and set the price of a service. And there seemed to be some proof of that, since the lawyer had wrote a letter to all the surveyors confirming that they were going to fix prices. We go to trial, and John and I are, for lack of a better word, the lead lawyers in the case. And so I explained to the jury why this letter does not say what it says. And after 4 days, the government held its hand up and said, basically, we've had enough. Would y'all settle this case by pleading the Surveyors Association guilty and paying a fine of $40,000, and we'll just turn everybody else loose. And these people were faced with going to prison. Well, we agreed to that, and all these people, they got off and life went on. But the thing I remember about that case is this. That was when John was a fairly young man. When he would get up on his feet, the jury would literally set up in the jury box and straighten up and start smiling, because they knew they were fixing to be entertained. And he entertained them, and he was devastating to the government's case. And when the government lawyers would get up, the jury would just kind of sit back down like, you're not any fun. And then when John would get up, they would all straighten up. And it was a really enjoyable case to try. And I guess I should say this, the public doesn't ever realize, or I don't think very few people ever realize this, that how frightening a courtroom is to some people, and not just the litigants. The courtroom is often frightening to the lawyers. And the reason some people survive in this business and other people don't is directly related to that fear. Some people should never be lawyers. Other people were born to do this. And unfortunately, you never know that until the first time you walk in that courtroom. But as everyone knows, this profession has a very high burnout rate. And the chief reason for that burnout rate is the fear that's generated by trying these cases. And that's another reason I think that things have become very specialized. And another reason for the mediation. People, that fear permeates the whole system. That's the reason for the plea bargain system, or a lot of the plea bargain system. And And if you're fortunate enough not to be afraid, this is a wonderful job. And that's not to say you don't have anxiety about going to court and trying cases and all that, but that's entirely different than just being scared to death. And some lawyers are scared to death and go ahead and try cases. I'm sure that one of these days when somebody watches this, they will say, well, that's the reason I guess my case didn't go to court. And they may be right.
Before I get to the final questions, do you have anything else you want to add? Maybe things I haven't asked about or things that stand out?
Well, I think the one thing that stands out to me in this profession is the friends that I've made, and the people I've been able to help. I give speeches at law school and at different lawyer functions all the time about the idea that this is not a business, this is a profession. And you have an absolute duty to act like a professional. You know, you don't, in my opinion, you don't go out at lunch and drink beer. You don't get yourself in trouble. You try to help people who come to you, oftentimes whether they can pay you or not, if they really need some help. And that you just have an absolute duty to do that because you owe it to society in general, but also to your community. And if you'll do that, the law practice, you will probably be very fortunate and live pretty well. Judge Butt, who I talked about earlier, used to refer to that as casting your bread upon the water. And that if you help somebody, they'll probably send their friend who can pay you. Maybe that person couldn't pay you, but they'll send their friend or 10 friends who can pay you. And there's a lot of truth in that. And that's been very rewarding for me to help people in the community. And it's also been very rewarding in that I have friends in every county in this state, probably, lawyer friends, who, and you just, you know that you have this network of family, which is, most people don't have. I mean, it's remarkable the number of friends that you create if you actively practice law.
If you had to talk to somebody who wasn't familiar with Washington County, maybe from another state or another part of the state, and they said, WH, tell me about Washington County, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that Washington County is a little microcosm of smart people. That we are so fortunate in that all this industry has grown up here in Northwest Arkansas, that talent from all over the state is drawn here by the University of Arkansas, and people want to stay here. And that through the years has created this remarkable synergy of money and people and that it's the Northwest Arkansas has literally exploded out of the ground in the last 40 years. And it's one of the greatest places to live in the country. You can't say enough about the University of Arkansas and its benefit to this community and what the flavor that it gives this community. And I'd also tell them this as it relates to the law business. I would tell them what old sheriff of Washington County always used to say, a guy named Kenneth McKee. Sheriff McKee used to say, the people of Washington County, they want the law enforced, but they don't want it enforced that much. In other words, they want to be left alone. They don't want anybody bothering them. And I think that's really a trait of Washington County and the people who live here. By and large, people want to be left alone here. I distinctly remember one time whenever I was probably 31, 32 years old, and the Safeway store was over on Lafayette Street. And of course, everybody used to go to Safeway. And I remember I was in line, and they used to have a 10-item line. Well, I got in a 10-item line, and maybe I had 11 or 12 items, but I'm going through there, and some lady starts giving me a hard time, and I said, "Lady, you know, just leave me alone." And she walks off, and there's this really nicely dressed little lady standing behind me. She was probably in her late 70s. She looked at me, she said, "Son, don't you just hate a bitch like that?" And that's sort of Fayetteville to me. I mean, people are independent, and they don't like a lot of rules.
How would you finish this sentence? My favorite thing about Washington County is?
My favorite thing about Washington County is the sense of independence that I have walking around this county. A sense of freedom, a sense of diversity, a sense of inclusion, a sense that the Democratic Party, it's so different than the rest of Arkansas. It's so different than even Benton County, Arkansas. This is still, though it's not as liberal as it used to be, this is still a very liberal community among many, many people. And I've always enjoyed that. And I hope it continues. And I hope that in just a few short years, we go from being a red state back to being a purple state, and then on to a blue state at some point. Because right now we have got some real bad national problems, or at least I think we do, from a government standpoint, as it relates to income disparity, health coverage, warmongering, all those things that I sort of have problems with.